the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Brought to you by NYFI, helping you deliver through volatility.
Hi everyone, you're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how's it going?
It's going great. I've just installed myself in an Airbnb here in Barcelona. I haven't crossed into Spain yesterday as the 6th country on my single Sally voyage. Still not in Africa yet, but slowly winding my way down there.
Yeah, making your way downtown. Love it. All right, let's get started talking about today's NYFI read. So let me share my screen here. And let's start with the Asia to US West Coast lane here.
Yep. Because here we see the three sub-indices that we've talked about before. So it's from Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and China over to the US West Coast. And it's basically a repeat of a story we've covered multiple times before. If you look at Northeast Asia, it's this volatile curve. It goes up and down and up and down. And if you recall last week, we talked about how Northeast Asia rates have suddenly accelerated dramatically week on week. And lo and behold, this week we see them go down a bit again. So Northeast Asia really is this volatile cousin over there. The two other ones, somewhat more stable. And if you do look at both Southeast Asia and China week on week, they are actually very stable. We've seen the market flattening now for a couple of weeks. And if you run the average, of course, it's a weighted average, we actually, on the overall Asia-US West Coast, see a slight decline in rate compared to last week. And if we stay on then the overall Asia-US West Coast, maybe have a look at what's going on also on the volatility part, because I know we've been discussing those a few times as well. So if we then look at Asia-US West Coast, and now also with the spread included, we also talked last week about how the spread had accelerated dramatically, and that could be interpreted as the market being very unsettled in terms of what the direction is going. What should be noted this week is the spread is now narrowing. It is still very high, absolutely, but it is not as high as last week. Furthermore, if you look at the asymmetry of the spread last week, you will notice that it is very high on the uncertainty to the upside, not as high to the downside. So there was clearly a push or an expectation, or you can say uncertainty, are rates actually going to go higher or not? That has subsided substantially than over the past week. And I would say, taking all of these elements into account, we see a flattening of the rates. We see now a shrinking of the spread. This all points to that the Asia-US West Coast market has actually reached its peak. We do seem to be at the apex, and the baseline expectation should be now a downwards curve going forward.
That's interesting. Are we seeing this on other indices? What do the other indices show at this point?
Yeah, and it is interesting because there's another, you can say, element that points in the same direction. One thing that, and I know on previous occasions we've talked about it before, if you look at an index like, for example, the Shanghai Container Freight Index, which is more heavily weighted towards quoted rates, or to some degree rates that might have been booked but not necessarily show up, we at times see the concept of phantom GRIs, where you will see rates that are very likely genuine quotes in the market, but subsequently, when you look at the cargo that actually gets loaded, materialize. And we see that multiple times over the last year and a half, that when the market reaches its apex, that's also when you have these enormous phantom GRIs. And we saw that 3 weeks ago. At that point in time, the SCFI also peaked. And actually now we see rates come down on SCFI for several weeks. Now the loaded rates follow. And when we were at the apex, you had a spread between the quoted rates and then what actually materialized, $900 per 40 foot. If you look at the period that was more stable, say the couple of months before we had the whole Hormuz affair, or you had a relatively stable period, April, early May, usually you have a spread of $200. So that you suddenly see this massive acceleration in the spread with quotes being much higher suddenly than what actually happens. And then the quotes all of a sudden start dropping. That seems to be a telltale sign now over the last at least year and a half that this is indeed when the market turns, when the phantom GRIs no longer become real.
Yeah, it's an interesting pattern. Are we seeing a similar thing on the East Coast as well?
This is actually a little bit curious because we don't yet. If you look at the prices for containers that's actually been loaded onto the US East Coast, they do seem to continue to increase. And maybe we can look at the rates also Asia-US East Coast with the spread included. Because if we do that, we will see a pattern that doesn't quite match yet what we see in US West Coast. We still see East Coast rates go up. We still see a wide spread. If we look at the phantom GRIs, they are also there, but not quite as high, but they have begun to turn as well. So that raises the question, why do we see this difference suddenly between West Coast and East Coast? And one, I think, strong hypothesis for this is it's actually capacity driven. Here this morning, I was diving into some of the weekly capacity data from Sea Intelligence. And if I look specifically last week, if I look at capacity Asia-US West Coast, capacity was up 17% year on year, whereas US East Coast was actually down 5% year on year. So from that perspective, you can argue, okay, a lot of capacity came in on US West Coast, starting to push rates down, but actually not enough capacity on US East Coast. So this could be purely capacity driven. One concern everyone should have when I say year on year is, as I think everybody remember, last year was weird, would be the polite way of putting it, in the throes of the trade war. So it might be better to do a comparison with 2 years ago to see a more stable baseline. But even then, we still see the same thing, because if I compare to 2 years ago, we also still saw significant capacity increase on US West Coast, not so much on US East Coast last week. But when I look forward for the next couple of weeks, this changes quite significant. What we are facing here in the next couple of weeks, at least if the carriers do deploy as they are planned, we're facing a 30% capacity growth on US West Coast. That's 30% up compared to 2 years ago, and a 40% capacity growth Asia-US East Coast compared to 2 years ago. That's what these 2 weeks we are getting into now. It might not materialize as much. Carriers might not necessarily sail all the services. They might not necessarily have the vessels in place. But to me, this is yet another indication. We have reached the apex of the Trans-Pacific market. Demand has been strong, likely fueled a lot by inventory replenishments and early peak season. But now even capacity is beginning to work against this peak.
Yeah. All right, we'll keep an eye on that over the next couple of weeks, see how the rates start trending. I think we should also touch on the Asia-North Europe trade as well.
Yes. So if we look at the Asia-North Europe trade, and here we're looking at it together with the futures, Asia-North Europe also appears to have peaked. That might also be sensible compared to the timing where we are. We had an early peak season. But if you also look at the market participants out in the futures market, what they expect is not an imminent rapid reduction. They expect rates are going to subside, but we've actually seen an increase once we get into August and October, in terms of where the futures market is. So the expectation for Asia North Europe clearly is, yes, we had an early peak, but the peak is not completely over. It's going to slide and subside somewhat more slowly. So we're likely going to have a slightly different development here than what we have seen over on the Trans-Pacific.
Yeah, less of a waterfall crash down and more steady decrease.
Yes, exactly.
All right, awesome. Thanks for sharing all that. Let's talk about the Hormuz and Red Sea updates. What's going on there?
It is just one litany after the other, and it seems everybody wants to, pardon the pun here, join the party. The reality is the war is full on again between the US and Iran. Reality is the Hormuz Strait is effectively completely closed. There has been a few vessels trying to get through. There's also been a few vessels that have been attacked by Iran. There's been a few vessels that have been stopped by US forces under their blockade. There seems to have been a tanker that ran into a mine. Basically, unless you have a very high appetite for risk, the Strait of Hormuz is de facto closed. We have then seen the Houthis step into the conflict. They have attacked a couple of ships now already. That has so far not changed anything for container shipping, which is interesting to watch. The niche carriers that have operated there for the past 2 years continue to operate unimpeded, it would appear. CMA CGM seems to continue their operations, and even the services shifted by Maersk and Gemini also appear to continue as planned, at least for now. So it seems the Houthis' interest would mainly be, that would be my take on what we've seen so far, on the tanker segment and not so much on the container segment. But it is definitely something to be watched because the Houthis have not chartered ships since September last year, so them entering in an active capacity is problematic. Also, let's keep in mind, just for recapping what the Houthis are all about, the Red Sea crisis was actually because the Houthis don't like what Israel is doing in Gaza. But this new round is because they have instituted a maritime blockade against Saudi Arabia. You might say, why Saudi Arabia all of a sudden? Very simply, because Saudi Arabia has been attacking fields in northern Yemen. And furthermore, Saudi Arabia seems to be upholding an embargo, so Iranian flights could not arrive in Yemen. And again, this is one of these takes where the conflict just seems to widen in terms of the participants involved. And another comment on the widening, and we should hope it doesn't widen further, but now we actually have a crossover between the US-Iran war and the Russia-Ukraine war. Because what we saw a couple of days ago was a Ukrainian attack on an Iranian ship in the Caspian Sea. The Caspian Sea is where you can move cargo by sea from Iran to Russia, which clearly Ukraine saw as a legitimate target. The problem is now Iran is threatening retaliation, and suddenly we have a live crossover between the two different wars. All in all, this does not bode for any type of stability in the Hormuz crisis or the Red Sea crisis anytime soon.
All right. Maybe on a also unstable note, we can talk about tariffs. So we have some new tariff announcements that were released in the past week. So what's going on there? On what basis? What do they look like now? What countries?
Yeah. From a very high level, the U.S. has imposed either 10 or 12.5% tariffs on basically everyone. Sure, there will be a few small countries unimpacted, but anything that matters, this counts for something like 98 or 99% of U.S. imports. So it goes for everybody. And it's what's called Section 301 tariffs. The explanation from the U.S. government is that they made a thorough investigation, and all of these many countries are not doing enough to stop forced labor, so they have to be penalized with tariffs. This is something a couple of companies have already sued the U.S. government over in court, saying that these are also illegal. The whole basis of the argument here is we need to step a little bit back. First, we had the IEEPA tariffs, which were then ruled illegal. The U.S. executive branch then instituted the Section 122 tariffs to replace the IEEPA tariffs. These ones could only stay for 5 months, and the day after they expired, they now come with the Section 301.
Peculiar
so
timing.
The argument from the exactly. So the argument for the plaintiffs is that this is not Section 301 at all. This is just a continuation of the illegal tariffs all the way back from IEEPA. Whether they will win that in court or not, of course, remains to be seen. It will likely be, just as we saw with IEEPA, a process that takes it through multiple different judicial layers, and we can wait months and months before there is ever anything coming out of it. So, is this new? I would say really it isn't. I think most people had expected that there would come new tariffs on top of it. It might also be expected that this will be challenged, and basically with the current administration, it seems this constant tariff turmoil is also just going to be there. We're going to have to live with this for probably the duration of the current administration at a very minimum.
Yeah, and if it's not 301, then it's probably some other 3-digit number that they'll throw out there.
Exactly.
All right. Maybe on a different note, let's talk about reliability metrics. So we had some new data come out for June.
Yes, we are towards the end of the month, so the usual monthly data from Sea Intelligence comes out. A couple of things to note on that one. We saw a slight global decline. So from May, where 65% of ships, these are deep sea vessels arriving on time, we're down to 63. All intents and purposes, that means we've been flatlined around this level several months, which overall is not good because this is a stable level that is materially below what we were used to pre-pandemic. It just seems the market can't find its feet in terms of getting reasonable reliability. They also then provide data purely for the alliances. So of course, this is again only the major east-west trades. It's only deep sea because it's the alliances. MSC has been seen as an alliance of one. And what we see continue there is actually quite a substantial difference in performance. If we start at the upper end, the Gemini came out at 93.4%, which is actually the highest performance by Gemini since they promised they would come out with the 90%. Below that, if we are to look not just at this, but the last couple of months as well, the pattern that is emerging here is Gemini tends to be at around the 90% level. MSC tends to be around 80%. Ocean Alliance around 70%, and Premier Alliance down around 55%. So we do have kind of a layering of the performance seen from the different carriers. Now, again, as I already mentioned, these are deep sea services. It's direct to the main ports. Different shippers might see different performances. That depends on, do you need feedering? Do you not need feedering? Was your cargo loaded, not loaded? These are all, of course, also elements of reliability, but they cannot be measured from the outside. That's data the carriers only have, and some of them provide them on a one-on-one basis with their clients. But overall, we do see this staggering of difference in performance across the alliances.
But I want to ask you too, what are they comparing it to? So it's reliability, like the actual arrival, actual departure, compared to what exactly?
Yeah, what it does is they would typically look at the performance schedule, and the problem here is a carrier might say something 6 months prior and say, this is our performance schedule. When you're then 2 months prior, they might change it slightly. 1 month, they might change it. And all the way up to almost the vessel arriving in port, they will constantly change. So the question is always, what should you actually compare to? And what Sea Intelligence does is they typically lock in, I believe it's about 3 to 4 weeks prior to the vessel departs, then we simply lock in, say, this is it. Because the carrier can, of course, change all the way up to the vessel arrives, then they would always have perfect reliability. That would not be an accurate reflection either. Right. So it is being locked in with several weeks of lead time, and that's what's being measured up against. It's then only measured in terms of, do you arrive within plus minus 1 calendar day? Say, why calendar day? Wouldn't it be at least be, say, plus minus 12 hours or 24 hours or whatever? But here comes the next problem. You measure the carrier versus what is it they promise their customers. And quite a few carriers only have calendar day. They'll say, we'll arrive on Tuesday. Mm-hmm. But they won't say at which point of time in the day, so not really promising anything. So measuring them by the hour would methodologically also be problematic. And you can, of course, then guess, or you could say what is in the port schedule, but then you're blurring the lines. What Sea Intelligence tries to do is measure the carriers on what is the product they're actually promising the customer.
Yeah. All right. Very thorough. Awesome. Okay. The last topic we had for today was about scrap yards, which is something I don't think we've talked about on the podcast, but can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, scrapping has been a problematic part of shipping, I was about to say, for decades. For those who don't know, when a ship reaches its natural life, end of life, typically gets sold to a scrap dealer. The ship is beached. A lot of ships are scrapped either in Bangladesh or in India. Literally, you will see people in flip-flops and blow torches take the ships apart under some pretty horrific conditions, in many cases at least. And as we are approaching a point where more and more ships now need to be scrapped, this becomes problematic. The EU, for example, instituted rules that several years ago now that any companies in the EU are not allowed to use these scrapyards. Ships needs to be scrapped under reasonable and safe conditions, typically in new-based shipyards. But here we run into a practical problem. First of all, the EU shipyards do not have enough capacity to handle all the ships that are going to be scrapped in the coming years. Secondly, they are also physically unable to handle the scrapping of some of the larger container ships that also needs to be scrapped over the coming years. So you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Physically, your ship can't get scrapped in the EU, but it wouldn't be allowed to scrap it outside the EU either. Then what do you do? And there have been carriers over the years that have been working with some of the shipyards in, for example, India. Because when I say it's been beached, keep in mind, it is a beach that's many kilometers long, and you've got maybe 100 different shipyards, and not all shipyards are the same. So shipping lines have been working with some of these shipyards to actually improve conditions to the point where hopefully they could get EU approval so we can increase the scrapping capacity that's going to be needed. And the latest is actually the EU Commission is now considering adding 2 of these Indian scrap yards to the list of approved yards. And I see that as overall a very positive development. Ships do need to be scrapped. Sorry, I used the word scrap. I know people in a lot of the industry would like to say recycling, which is actually also true. But given being scrapped, we do recycle basically everything. Steel gets reused, inventories everything gets reused. So fine, it is actually recycled, but we need more capacity. So seeing a positive development where finally maybe a couple of the Indian yards are reaching levels where they can also be approved is certainly a positive move. I would like to see many more yards improve their conditions so they can also be allowed to be used.
Yeah, that's definitely some positive news. All right, Lars, anything else you want to add to today's episode before we log off?
No, I think that pretty well covers what we have seen so far. So as usual, we have given everybody a barrage of numbers and different facts. So I think we should give a little bit of time for contemplation. What was just being said?
Let it digest. All right.
Yes.
Awesome. If you haven't already subscribed, we're on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube. We also have a newsletter that recaps what we talk about in the episode, including images of the charts that we review. So if you haven't subscribed to that, it is in the show notes. And we'll be back next week. I hope everyone has an awesome week. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets podcast, presented by NYFI. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app.